Welcome to episode 3 of Rising Above Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World. I'm Michael.
And I'm Jim.
In this episode, we will explore what trauma does to your brain. We'll hear from some experts in the field of trauma and discuss their insights. We will also examine how trauma has impacted our own lives with an emphasis on how it manifests in our lives today in terms of dysfunctional behaviors and our reaction to life on life's terms. Finally, we will discuss our own recovery efforts, both our successes and our ongoing challenges, all with the idea of working towards whether it is possible. We're trying to answer the question, is it possible to really rise above trauma? Jim and I are both in therapy and 12-step recovery, so we may use some of the 12-step framework in our discussion.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. All right. So the first question, what does trauma do? Because I'd like to first of all, I know an episode when we kind of talked a little bit about what trauma is, but what does trauma do to your brain?
Yeah. That is a great question. It's something, I've been learning about all these years of recovery. And I came up with, I found a really interesting quote from a famous book, uh, and it's The Body Keeps the Score. And I'm going to read it for you right now. Here goes. If the people whom you naturally turn to for care and protection terrify or reject you, you learn to shut down and to ignore what you feel. When your caregivers turn on you, you have to find alternative ways to deal with feeling scared, angry, or frustrated. Managing your terror all by yourself gives rise to another set of problems: disassociation, despair, addiction, a chronic sense of panic, and relationships that are marked by alienation, disconnection, and explosions. And so that is a quote from, I think, how do you say, Bessel van der Kolk, Michael?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
Yeah. And so I have him quoted several times in my book, Freedom and Dysfunction in an All-American Family, about my trauma growing up. And so one of the things that comes to mind to me in my, the last 20 years, 30 years, I've been in recovery since July 23rd, 1987. That's when I got sober from alcohol. But it's easy for me to freak out in certain situations. And I've heard different language put on that. So I've heard something like explosive disorder, and then it could be an extreme of passive aggressive. So the passives, I say nothing. I say nothing because, in my trauma experience, um, saying something when my father was angry, to me, the way I perceived it, that was probably dangerous. And either whether it was a verbal retort or maybe some violence. And so I learned systematically over time as a young person that you probably in general don't say things, don't say anything or object to a problem. Internalize it, say nothing. And uh, and so as I got older, well, my father is not there, but there's other people that are not quite so lethal around me. And then I would, and it's been a little while, but I mean, it's not that impossible. It's pretty easy to go from saying nothing to exploding. And
Hmm.
that, and I think that could be partly from that trauma experience where I need explosive anger in order to stand up for myself. But then
Yeah.
go.
Go.
I'll just finish. You can share. Jump in. But then the explosive anger makes me into the bad guy. Luckily, I'm not violent. I rejected violence because I saw the darkness of it. But I I make things worse. So instead of inviting empathy from the people like my wife or my daughters or friends or at work, instead of inviting empathy from them and an understanding so we could move forward, I will actually become the cause of the problem. We will actually forget the original problem because my explosion overshadows all of it. Very dysfunctional way of living.
No, and I'm glad that we're talking about what trauma does to us in the present day, because I think it is very, I've heard a lot of people say, you quit your whining. You're talking about something that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago, get over it. And this is not about hanging on to something that happened in the past. This is about how I refer to it as tapes. Like, you know, it's like our brains are, the old analog tapes, the old magnetic tapes. And they were recording what was happening to us when we were kids. Those tapes, because, the thing about the human brain is it will respond to situations based on similar situations it has experienced in the past. It will compare, okay, what is this like? So that is why when we are presented in the present time with a situation that may be in fact completely different, but our brain looks for what is similar with the traumatic experiences. Okay, this is now how we respond.
Right. And that, I mean, that came up in couples therapy many times when my wife and I were in couples therapy, let's say 10 years ago, where my therapist literally, she taught my wife to say, um, I'm not your father. I'm not your father. So, I mean, my trauma, I don't have PTSD where I actually remember the experience. I don't think I ever had that. But the
Yeah.
complex PTSD, where I've learned behaviors as a result of living, being immersed into that in that experience, that stays with me. So I've had my wife relating to what you're saying, and my therapist tell me, okay, wait, this is you may be upset at your wife, but she's not your dad. It's not that dangerous. So I've had to be trained to relax a little bit in these situations.
Yeah. And I've had exactly the same situation. In my case, it was my mother. And I have responded, and this is not something that I was consciously aware of at the time, but I was responding to situations with my wife like my wife was my mother, even though they're not similar at all. But so, like, for you, it was that living with that fear of that lethal fear all the time, the threat of violence. And as I shared in a last episode, for me, I had, my mother was constantly screwing with my sense of reality. And so how that affects me today is I always have to ask myself what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling. Is that really objectively true? Or is this just how I am responding to it? And that's what's so kind of insidious about trauma, is that it alters the way that we respond to events in the present day. Like, I remember you sharing a story, like something about one of your daughters. Do you remember the train station story?
Yeah. Hmm.
And how you kind of blew up there? Can you share that a little bit?
Well, it was my daughter was a part of her work. They asked her to chase down an escaped adolescent psych patient because that was in her work, and they literally asked her to chase. And she ended up at L.A. Union Station, and it was nighttime, and it's not like it's like horrible there, but it's just I don't know. I'm hyper vigilant now. Downtown area. I'm thinking potential gang members, and it's the city. and I couldn't get my daughter to leave. Even we were driving towards her in our car. She had her own car, my wife and my other daughter. Everybody wanted her to leave, and she wouldn't leave. And so my reaction to that, I'm not gonna say there is some hypervigilance, and it was me so upset. Like in my mind, I was almost disowning her, and I almost spoke like my father, which was like I on the phone while we were driving towards her in a way that would be like, oh my God, thank God I have this program. I can admit I'm wrong, but talking to her like she's disowned, like she is out of my life, because my
Yeah.
sense is she's in a dangerous situation and she won't leave it. And I grew up with that, and I don't deal with that well.
And what I love about that, you sharing that story, is when I listen to it, I think, you know, what what's the big deal, of course. And but that's because I did not have the same kind of trauma as you. Now, from an analytical standpoint, I can absolutely understand how that is triggering. And that's when, we talk about, the trauma triggers and things like that. But like, as somebody who did not have that exact kind of trauma, I, I don't have that emotional reaction to that. But
Right.
like, for example, if, my wife tells me that something is not about me, my immediate reaction is, oh, she's lying to me. Um, she's, trying to gaslight me. All these things that I have absolutely no evidence for, but it's based on my reaction to my mother.
Right. It's yeah, a different manifestation of of the learned behavior from the old days of trauma. And the thing that's very clear from the research is that the trauma sears I don't know, different neurons in our brains are activated, and they remain deeply embedded. So the changing of that behavior is difficult. And for me, it is significant because you brought up that story. So here, I mean, the one at the Union Station, the train station, here it is, 35 years later. I have a great relationship with my daughter. Thank God. I know how to admit I'm wrong. But that kind of thing, that kind of language and tone of voice at my daughter, I still cringe when I think about it. So, in other words, it's manifesting in a way could potentially destroy relationships this much later. I'm not thinking about my dad attacking me, but I'm
Yeah.
acting in a way that's partly built on by the trauma, which is not based in reality.
Yeah, and that's what I think a lot of people don't understand about trauma is like I think the kind of the basic understanding of trauma is like the Vietnam War flashback phenomenon, right? Like, a soldier comes back from Vietnam and it's 4th of July and fireworks are going off and he flashes back to a firefight in Vietnam. And I don't want to minimize that because, obviously that is a traumatic experience, but that that's not, and I don't even want to say that that's not necessarily what we're talking about when we talk about trauma, but what I want to stress is that the reaction is not necessarily a logical one. Like, you know, fireworks, if you're somebody who experienced a firefight and you hear fireworks going off, that's kind of a logical connection. What you're talking about and what I'm talking about is we respond with things that on the surface don't appear to have anything to do with your father and my mother, and what we experience. But in some level, our brain recognizes a similarity
Right.
and overcompensates.
And that's complex PTSD. And I just recently, found books on that maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago, as I was starting to think about writing my book. But yeah, the complex. So yes, and part of the reason I wrote my book is I have a sense that nobody believes me, or maybe I don't, maybe it didn't even happen. because I
Yeah.
don't have a memory of my dad attacking us. It's just I've learned this hypervigilance, all the way to the point where, my hypervigilance with, we have traumatic events like 9/11 and the riots in LA, where everybody's kind of on hypervigilant mode, and I feel comfortable. I've literally felt comforted because, oh, now and I love dystopian movies, apocalyptic movies, because the idea is, oh, we're in apocalypse. Okay, yeah, that's what I always thought it was, apocalypse. And
Yes.
so it's a strange frame of mind to try to deal with the world with.
Yeah. And I've noticed that before, like when I was, we haven't talked too much about addiction yet, but like when I was in active addiction, I look back at that now from a place of recovery, and I look back and I see, God, I was blowing up my life. I was blowing up my wife's life, blowing up my children's lives. Um, I was inflicting trauma. And I have to face that. But um, when I look back at that and I look at it from a place of recovery and I go, why would anyone want to be in that situation? But to some extent, it felt normal. It felt like I know this feeling, right? I know this feeling of my life is going off the rails. This feels familiar to me
Right, and that's why
because
recovery is so hard, because we don't have that, and it's like, it's empty. Maybe it's not there. I mean, that's parts of recovery. It feels empty without it. Even
yeah,
though the thing that's happening is maybe a threat of incarceration or destroying life, but without it, it's like, oh my goodness, there's something about that. I told you about ennui, or just depression, and so
yes,
there's something about that was like, hey, at least my behavior is causing this crazy world, so I have some control.
exactly. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's it. Yeah. Because when I think back, like what I read last episode about, my mother suddenly announcing that she was leaving my father and that, he was going to get violent and going to hurt us, all of this just complete gaslighting. But, um, it was like little trauma, little t trauma after little t trauma after little t trauma. And but yeah, it was what you just said. See, I wasn't in control. There's something about, and it manifests 30 years later as my life is blowing up, but I'm the one doing it this time.
Exactly. And that was one of my biggest problems with my father. I didn't realize it till later, but which was because he's a drug addict, alcoholic, unpredictability. So that added, and besides being violent and skilled violent like a hitman, the unpredictability with the drugs and alcohol, that added a big thing. So let's move on to talk about hypervigilance, because I have a really good quote here from
Yeah.
a pretty well-known trauma expert. Her name is Carolyn Spring, and I think it might be, add some frame to this. So she said, "This is the fingerprint of trauma in our lives: the inability to accurately assess threat with our front brains, which I call the prefrontal cortex, because we are continually hijacked by the oversensitive back brain, which I consider the lizard brain, or the um, what's it called? The not hypothalamus, the
It's the I
amygdala,
believe
amygdala, amygdala.
amygdala.
I'm
Thank
talking about
you.
the
Yes.
amygdala, the animal brain. So going into that amygdala too quickly, and so situations which would require, and part of trauma therapy that this woman brings up is that when I'm upset like this, hypervigilant, one of the strategies is to try to calm down and get to the prefrontal cortex, and the front, to relax and think. But it's really easy for me to just automatically shift into panic mode
Yes.
when for me the biggest trigger is potential violence. So like my daughter downtown, my or down in the train station downtown, me and my wife at the Tenderloin in San Francisco, dangerous place. Anything where there's a potential, even with the politics of Trump in office and a lot of his threats and the threats that his followers put out
Yes.
towards people who wouldn't vote like him. I internalize that and just wonder, or Trump taking over the army, is he going to bring them here? So it's easy for me to go down a rabbit hole of hypervigilance where the world is not a safe place.
Yeah. And I remember reading, and I believe Bessel von Kolk talks about this in The Body Keeps the Score. The thing about the amygdala is that the amygdala has no concept of time. So when, the amygdala, which is where the trauma is imprinted, it is an eternal present for the amygdala. It is the prefrontal cortex that is able to process the concept of time and that time has passed. So, when people say, well, it's in the past for the amygdala, no, it's not.
Mm.
That's why we actually have to do trauma work. We have to do therapy. We have to do 12-step work. We have to do, particularly in 12 steps, particularly step 4 and step 5, because these traumas are not, they're not in the past for the amygdala. It's a process. Like, I was doing something called ART, or accelerated resolution therapy, which is basically
Well, can you,
trying to,
Michael, hang on that.
yeah.
Let's go. Let's cover that. We're going to do ART. We're going to get to that.
Oh, sure, sure, sure.
Because yeah, I want you to tell us more about that, definitely, because that's going to be at the recovery efforts part. So let's hold that. Please hold that thought. We're going to go there. All right. I want you, and I want to get to that. Right now we have about 15 more minutes, so we're going to move a little bit faster. I'm just going to shorten it. So this disequilibrium in a regular state of the world, I experience disequilibrium equally. I mean, often, and the addictions and dysfunctional behaviors are ways for me to get out of that miserable state, disassociation, and so that is a way to go the wrong way. Now I've listed codependent behaviors as dysfunctional behaviors, and I don't think we'll have time to do all these, but I'm going to mention them. This comes from Codependence Anonymous, and they have patterns. And so I have certain patterns that come from dysfunctional families. One is denial, low self esteem, compliance, control, and avoidance. Those are all patterns that thrive in a dysfunctional environment. Now, trauma being an extreme form of that. So I'm going to pick a couple. Maybe you can pick a couple. I'll just start with the first one, and then maybe you can talk about one or two that hit you, make sense. First one is denial. It says, think they can take care of themselves without any help from others. Now, for me, generally, I I like to get help from others. I'm in recovery, but if I look back before my recovery on July 22nd, 1987, I was in a room all by myself, and I never thought, and I had been drinking, and I never thought about reaching out to anybody for help. It would be like a wounded animal crawling into a hole somewhere. And so, in general, it's not like I'm afraid to reach out, but that is a significant, because when I think about it, I could have gotten help. I didn't think anyone existed on the earth that could have
Well,
helped me.
yeah, and you had learned that help was not going to be forthcoming. I mean, when we are young, we learn to work with what we get, and if you're not getting help from caretakers, that's what you learn. So
Exactly.
you
And that's why in recovery we point out, we emphasize, us who are, you and I are like focused in recovery, we emphasize avoiding isolation, reaching out. But if I'm in a bad place, I have to break that denial, because if I'm in a bad place, the last thing I want to do is reach out. So the depression, the ennui, makes reaching out sound like the impossible. And so that's one of the challenges of this trauma, I believe, is it reinforced this denial system, which causes me partly to isolate.
Yeah. I was really struck by number three, compliance, are afraid to express their beliefs, opinions, and feelings when they differ from those of others. I hate conflict, absolutely hate it, to the point that I will not say what I feel, not say what I think. I will let things go that maybe I shouldn't let go. But in terms of how it affects me, I don't stand up for myself enough,
Right.
because I could not, when I was a kid, what I felt, what I thought, I was reinforced to me over and over again, what I thought or felt didn't matter. So I had to push those down. And I find it very difficult to express what I want and not be demanding about it. It's like I learned, oh, if I want something, I got to take it, right? I can't ask for it. So it's kind of similar to what you were talking about with denial too.
No, that compliance a bit, and think about all of our addictions. The idea of I don't know how to ask for it. I don't know, and then I just go off the rails with acting out in some addiction. It's like because it's the way I know how to just do what I want. But most of the time, I'm actually trying to be a very compliant good boy. So that compliance is a big one. One other one I want to talk about before we move on is avoidance. And that was another big one, similar to what we're talking about, the denial. It says, act in ways that invite others to reject, shame, or express anger toward them. And I alluded to that earlier about the passive aggressive. So I'm passive, saying nothing, compliance, like we're saying, and then it goes into an outburst or a very like a rude statement. And I act, so instead of getting my needs met, that turns into a shit show. And so why not just go do the acting out and all the other addictions? Because it's really hard to act in ways that get my needs met with humans, with
Yeah.
people. You've
Yeah.
had that experience, I assume.
Yes, I have. It's well, in some ways, I think it's also related to number four with control, where it says adopt an attitude of indifference. I very much like, you know what, fuck everybody. You know what, they're not going to be there for me, and I don't know that as a fact, but that's what it feels like. And so, um, yeah, I do things. It says use addiction to avoid feeling vulnerable. I very much believe that addiction is a learned behavior to avoid. It was a way of soothing ourselves. It was a way of avoiding what we could not feel, not necessarily what we didn't want to feel, but what we couldn't because it wasn't safe.
Right. And so could that we have about 10 minutes left, so let's move on. That's a perfect segue into what recovery efforts have we made. So we talk for the last segment, about some of the things we've done to heal our trauma. And I mean, I'm going to quickly talk about 12-step recovery, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what you've done recently in therapy that you were alluding to
Sure.
earlier.
Yeah.
So I will just mention for me, 12-step recovery, and it really has forced me to learn to get out of that compliance, stand up for yourself, don't be a doormat. I work with a sponsor in recovery. I tell the sponsor what's going on with me. We have a fourth step that I tell them what the exact nature of my wrongs throughout my whole life. And so this is an opportunity to speak to another man and be vulnerable with them. And it's
Yeah.
built into the steps. And then not only that, I become aware of these dysfunctional behaviors. We call them character defects or shortcomings in my interactions in life. And then I also am asked to make amends for the harms I've done. Okay, now the steps don't really address this type of trauma very well in terms of um, you know, there's a big mess there that I've worked all 12 steps and I still have a mess there.
Yeah.
It's not a total fix, but I think it goes a long way in getting us started to go out into the
Yes.
world, make amends, speak to other people, don't hide, don't avoid, stand up for yourself, and admit that I have a part in it, not just a victim of trauma.
Yeah, exactly. I think that when I think back to particularly step four, and one of the things, like you said, it is, looking at our wrongs. I want to kind of clarify that one of the things that we look at in step four is what was my part, and part of that is learning to not take on responsibility for the things that were not, in fact, our fault.
That's good. I like that. That's a good insight.
Um,
Because we're
and
starting it with resentment often, but then we're
yeah,
looking at our part to take accountability, not be a victim, but also get clear because we're not sure what's our part, right? That's part of our sickness.
yes, and that often also how this relates to addiction is that addiction is often, it's a form, yes, it's an attempt to fill that void, right? But it's also a form of self-punishment, right? This is what we're worth. We're only worth this. We don't have any self-worth. um that's why, like, haranguing addicts is like the worst thing you can actually do. I mean, I remember when I first got into recovery, one of the first things that my then temporary sponsor said to me was, you have worth. You are worth more than this, which was the last thing that I expected to hear.
Right.
Because all my life, starting with my mother, I had learned that I was not, in fact, worth anything. So,
Yep.
yeah, I think the steps alone are not enough to deal with trauma, but what they can do is, how at the end of every episode you say recovery starts with an honest conversation. That's what I think the steps do, is they start that conversation with yourself.
Very good. And so we're running out to the last few minutes here, talking about therapy and the different kinds of therapies. One of the therapies for me has been narrative therapy, which is writing my book. And I felt palpable healing from writing my book, even adding some fictional parts in to give the poor boy who had nowhere to go, didn't know what to do, some agency. But you had some other type of therapy you've done that I'm not really very familiar with. What
Yeah,
was that?
accelerated resolution therapy, or ART. Basically, what it's the basic idea behind it, and I won't go into the technical aspects of it, but it's designed to get the prefrontal cortex talking to the amygdala. And so for the prefrontal cortex to be able to tell the amygdala, this is over, this is no longer actively happening. And what we say in ART is, you don't lose the memory. The memories don't go away. It's the feeling, it's the emotional impact. That is what we work on. So I still have all the memories of what memories I do have of trauma, but they don't have the same emotional weight that they once had before this therapy.
And so how are you feeling now in terms of your recovery?
I mean, I feel like it's a journey. I know that sounds cliched, but I really feel like a shark, in the sense of, if sharks, like, have to keep swimming, right? If they don't keep water moving over their gills, they die. That's kind of how I feel, like, not in like an urgent or panicked way, but I have to keep growing. I have to keep trying to be a better human being, be always grow. I feel like if I get stagnant, then yeah, I can slip back into my addictions, my old patterns, everything like that. So I feel like I have to keep trying to grow.
Okay, great. And I wanted to mention movement as another form of therapy, which also came out of writing my book. It started with just about the trauma and it ended up called Freedom and Dysfunction. And I believe that, and I've Body Keeps the Score. It talks about the traumas in the body. And so
Yeah.
all the sports I've played, snow skiing, water skiing, surfing, basketball, the basketball I still play, I played today, banging up against somebody, part of the game, not trying to do anything weird. Just that intimacy of that. In sports, I feel like that is part of the healing. And I'm just grateful that my father, the violent guy, was also a sports guy and he introduced me to sports. So I think some of my healing has taken place through movement. Or
Mhm.
even if I'm in a bad place, I can do chores and feel better. So this movement of the body, in AA, we say it's a program of action. So this idea of movement as being a central part of recovery, not just thinking my way into better living, but living my way into better thinking. I think
Yeah,
that's also crucial to this
I
dealing with
I
trauma.
agree. Which, really now leads to kind of the question that we've been, thinking about through this whole episode. The purpose of this episode was, answer that question. Is it possible to rise above or overcome trauma's effects? So for you, Jim, what do you think is the answer to that question? Is it possible to overcome trauma's effect?
I'd say it's not 100%, but I have some very good days, and I have a very productive life, and I have a marriage of 30 years, and we get along very well. I have a career. There's a lot of things that have been resolved. Um,
Yeah,
but the part that I still struggle with is with depression, some anxiety. And so if that is a residue of trauma, there's other factors. But those are the things to be happy, joyous, and free on a daily basis. That's not all, lives aren't always like that. But I think, like you, I'm still working on, settling in my brain to have more days of happy, joyous, and free, and more of an acceptance in the bad days.
exactly. Yeah, I think there isn't a simple answer as yes, it is possible. No, it is not possible. I think that definitely we can move forward, we can grow. Can we be quote unquote cured or fixed entirely? That's harder to answer. But um
Right.
I think, for people who, and I just want to end by saying, the work that I've done recently, I don't know that I could have done that when I was younger. I feel like it happened when it was ready to happen, when I was ready to do it. So I don't know that people should necessarily beat themselves up if they're not ready to address trauma in their past. I think, we all come to that in our own time.
I agree. And facing it, at least it makes it so we can share it with other people who've suffered it, and it's a conversation we can all have.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you for joining us on Rising Above Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World for our third episode. Look for our next episode coming in 2 weeks. We do believe that the worst effects of trauma and addiction can be overcome, and recovery starts with a simple, honest conversation. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.